Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar in the wake of COP26. The topics for tonight: wins and losses and implications for future Pacific climate advocacy. And we've got about 230 people from across Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific, in particular Tuvalu and Kiribati and Fiji. And we have friends also from Europe. I can see they're up very early in Geneva at the moment, and you're all very welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country that we're all on, wherever you are in the world. I'm here on the northern edge of Sydney on Garigal land, Garigal and Darug country, on what's known as the Hawkesbury River. And you are gathered today, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of your country. And I'd also like to particularly welcome all the Pacific Islanders who are with us tonight. It's great to see so many people from the region joining us. And also, I think we'd be important that we remember our brothers and sisters in the Solomons who are facing a difficult time with the unrest that's going on there at the moment. So we remember them. Well, tonight we've got 4 speakers, and some of them have either just come out of quarantine today or just finished it from their sessions in Glasgow. And so not only is there 11 and 12-hour time change for people, but they're also coping with the change in temperature from Glasgow in November, which would, for those of us who weren't there, we're glad that they went. Now, each of our speakers are going to speak for 15 minutes. I should introduce myself. I'm Phil Glendenning from the Edmund Rice Centre. And the Edmund Rice Centre has one of our major projects is the Pacific Calling Partnership. And I acknowledge those who on the webinar today who've been part of that for so long, particularly Jill Finane and Michael Finane. Jack Frawley is here. We'd also acknowledge the presence of Simon Bradshaw and the great job he did in Glasgow, bringing the issues to the attention of the world, and Reverend James Bugwine also, who was such a powerful Pacific voice. Now, just a few housekeeping exercises, and the need for which I think we may have just heard. What I would like everybody to do, if you're not speaking, is to make sure that you have your microphone muted. And just in terms of Zoom etiquette, remember that even if there might be a share screen on, your camera would still be on unless you turn it off. So if you decide to get up and get changed for bed or whatever, remember that the camera is on. And I speak from experience. So if you make sure that your microphone is muted at all times, and make sure that your camera is off if you decide to do something you don't want the rest of the world to see. Also, after our 4 speakers, there will be time for a Q&A that will be facilitated by my colleague Corinne Fuggeray from the Edmund Rice Centre and the coordinator of the Pacific Calling Partnership. And but if you want to ask a question, we'd like you to enter that into the chat at the bottom central part of the screen. Corinne will field those questions and monitor them as we go. And we hope we'll have about 20 minutes to 30 minutes for a Q&A at the end. So I hope that all of that is in order. Okay, our first speaker tonight is an old friend of ours, Maina Talia. Maina comes from Tuvalu. He's the co-founder and secretary of the Tuvalu Climate Action Network, otherwise known as TUCAN. He has worked closely with the Edmund Rice Centre and the Pacific Calling Partnerships program for many years, and we've attended numerous COPs together. And Maina has just recently returned from COP26, which he attended as a member of the Tuvalu government delegation. And we were happy and proud to be able to, in a small way, support his work there. And Maina's going to talk to us with a bit of an overview over the COP26 process, the Pacific Islander voices, including the side events, and some broad impressions of the COP26 outcomes. And as a veteran of many COPs over many years, it was great to see how the Pacific voice was cutting through this time. And one of those powerful voices is Maina Talia, and we're delighted to have you with us tonight, Maina. And so over to you.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this, I would call it a debriefing Galano session for all of us, especially for us who have attended the COP26 earlier this month. Well, I will briefly talk about the process or processes, especially from a CSO NGO perspective, having attended few COPs and also being part of the Dalanoa discussion around our Pacific demands. I think it is very important that we outline few challenges that we encountered during our time in Glasgow. I will leave the rest to my colleagues that will follow suit. Well, first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge with great appreciation the support rendered by our donor partners, friends, and colleagues who are not able to travel to Glasgow, but were able to support us from home. They stood with us in solidarity and in spirit. They have worked tirelessly behind the scene to ensure our voices are heard at the international stage. For that, I want to extend my personal thanks to all the colleagues who have supported us, ensuring that we'll make our way to Glasgow safely and return home or return to Sydney safely. Thank you so very much. But let me reflect on a few things regarding the COP process or processes. COP26 was supposed to be the most inclusive and accessible COP ever. Hence, it was the opposite. Let alone the backdrop of COVID, it is also being used as a political tactic to ensure our voices are not heard in the negotiation rooms. Small delegations like Tuvalu and other small island states, we couldn't cover all meetings that runs in parallel to one another. It is merely first come, first serve event. It is very limited access to certain number of peoples. If you are late, you're out of the room. So I would say that those are some of the political challenges that we face as small delegations who attended COP26 in Glasgow. Accessibility for people with disability was an issue. Many were not able to access the conference because of disability. However, one of the most interesting thing that stood out for me was the World Leaders Summit that happened on Monday and Tuesday on the first week of the meeting of the COP. Traditionally, first week is a negotiation week where all technical teams are involved. The second week is the high-level segment or the ministerial level dialogue, where unfinished businesses or texts that has not reached consensus from the first week of negotiation will be tabled for ministerial deliberations to find some landing zone or compromised. However, COP26 did not follow that traditional way of doing or engaging in COP meetings. Having the World Leaders Summit on the first 2 days of the week stole the heart of the negotiation process. Here we are listening to world leaders delivering predetermined promises because negotiations which have started, they have not reached any consensus. And yet we see US, the rich countries, industrialized countries making all these promises. I would call that all those predetermined promises because negotiations have started. Our Pacific voice during COP26. Despite COVID, perhaps I personally feel that COP26 was one of the most vocal COPs, I would say, for the Pacific Islands. The work of our climate warriors is unmatched. We should applaud and acknowledge their support Their voices outside locked doors must not go unnoticed. They have put pressure on world leaders on our demands. Of course, the support from the Pacific Conference of Churches through the Reverend James Bhagwan and Iemaima, and also from PCAN, who have done quite a lot. And I am grateful for their support to keeping the voices of the Pacific alive, and especially the 1.5 conversation up on the table. Thank you so very much. Another thing that stood out for me, not just in COP26, but it becomes like, for me, I would say it's become now a tradition for TUCAN, or the Tuvalu Climate Action Network, to have side events. I have been hosting side events since COP21, and also speaking on COP18, COP21, 22, 23, 24, 25, and up to 26 with the support of the Edmund Rice Centre, Phil, and also Jill Fernane and Maria, and so forth. And now with the support of Corinne, we're able also to host another side event this year. And why, for me, it's important to have those side events, because for me personally, that's how we can get our voice into those locked doors meetings, through the media, getting all the media outlets to come and telecast our event. It is very important. Say, for example, last year, the last COP25 in Madrid, I wouldn't use the word I, but through the support, we were able to host another side event. And it was around and framed around the theme, not without my neighbor. What is most important is the fact that Scott Morrison took time out of Parliament to respond to our side event. That is very important for me, because Morrison took time out of Parliament to respond to our need, to our demand. And this is the same thing that we did this year. And the side event is called Am I Not Your Neighbor? With the understanding that neighbor is no longer someone living next door to you when it comes to the context of climate change. But we have extended the definition of a neighbor to be a geopolitical neighbor, someone who has been impacted by actions of others, especially those who live around us. So the event was packed with the support of Pastor Ray Minican from Australia, the support of the Honorable William Sua from New Zealand, and also the Honorable Seve Baniu from Tuvalu, the Minister of Climate Change and Finance, and of course, our dear friend, the Reverend James Bhagwan, who was also present and one of the speaker at our event. So I think the whole idea of having those events is to make noise, amplify the same message that our youth, our colleagues, our friends from the Pacific are also doing in a different way. Not trying to romanticize or make it look sexy, but in a way that we can advocate and pass on our message through different medium. And for that, I'm grateful for the support by all the friends and colleagues. For me, lastly, the impressions of COP26, for me, we have nailed it, and others may not feel comfortable with it. Some may say that, COP26 is a failure, but attending 6 COPs, I would say that, we got something out of it. We cannot get everything done in one COP, but at least we got some of our demand listed or reflected in the COP outcome, especially the mentioning of fossil fuels. Despite the fact we don't like the language that was crafted in the text, from phasing out fossil fuels to phasing down fossil fuel, but yet we are grateful that it reflected in the text. And it's something that we should need to look seriously into it, and also influence us with our influence on our government. I think we can do more in partnership and in genuine partnership and collaboration. We did our best in COP26, not just to make noise, but to develop that relationship with our government, because we cannot afford to come up with different views. We need to collaborate with our government and to ensure that, you know, we are heading towards the same aim and same purpose while there at COP26. I will stop there for now, but I would love to further engage in our Talanoa later on, but with the support of Iemaima, Langi, and Siobhan. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Maina. A round of applause around the room, and thank you for your leadership in this space for so many years, and having been to a number of those side events and participated in that you've organised over many years. You're able to get prime ministers and presidents into the room regularly, and certainly the way the Tuvalu delegation this time was made that cry that was heard all around the world. So in no small part due to you and the work of your colleagues. So thanks again, Maina. Well done. Our second speaker comes to us from Canberra, and she too is just got out of quarantine. Dr. Siobhan McDonnell is the senior lecturer at the Crawford School of Policy at ANU, and significantly, she was the lead Fiji negotiator for loss and damage at COP26. And of course, loss and damage is an area that where there remains quite a bit to do. So Siobhan, you're very welcome, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Maina, for beginning our Talanoa tonight. I want to begin by acknowledging that I come to you today from a very wet day in Canberra, on very beautiful Ngunnawal Ngambri land. And it's particularly special to me today because it's my first day out of quarantine since getting back, so I could actually go outside and celebrate being on the land. So I want to begin, before I start my formal presentation and really describe for you what happened during the negotiations around loss and damage at COP26, just by acknowledging the incredible efforts of civil society from the Pacific and of all the Pacific delegation who really went to COP. So, you know, I'm Australian of Bermudan heritage, actually, and it is a great honour to negotiate for Fiji and to work alongside the Pacific leadership in these spaces. But I also want to acknowledge the incredible and Herculean efforts of civil society in these spaces, and of the other negotiators that I work alongside, and of the Pacific leadership. And very early on in COP, the Prime Minister of Fiji, Frank Bainimarama, sent out a text just naming the fact that as a negotiating delegation, we were outnumbered by the fossil fuel industry 12-1. So that's just the fossil fuel industry, but it gives you a sense of scale in terms of the representation of the Pacific. The Pacific plays way beyond the scale of the delegation that it sends, and it does that through these coordinated efforts from civil society, through negotiations and into the leadership. And my sense of the outcomes from COP are perhaps more mixed than Maina. Like, I think there were some significant gains that were made in terms of keeping that crucial 1.5 pathway alive, which is so crucial for the Pacific, and particularly for atoll islands like Tuvalu, like Maina's homeland, but also all of our other atoll islands. This is really, you know, this is the point at which they cease to exist. So that 1.5 pathway is the thing that we are fighting for. We succeeded in terms of getting significantly more adaptation financing, but there is so much more to be done. We did get fossil fuels recognised and the phasing down of fossil fuels. There were additional NDC commitments, and these become incredibly important when we come back next year and we look at 2030, and locking in governments, including our own government in Australia, to 2030 commitments, and to looking at that pathway towards 2050 and net zero. It needs to begin now. We can't wait to 2050. But the big disappointments, one of the very big disappointments was in the space of loss and damage, which is part of what I want to share with you today. So while we made some gains in that space, there was also some areas of disappointment. I don't know what's happened with one of my dogs, but I'm sorry if you can hear barking. Anyway, so I'll share my screen now and I'll just begin. What I want to do is just show you really how the Pacific led in that negotiation space around loss and damage, because it's again a testament to how hard the Pacific works through these negotiation forums. So I'll just share my screen and begin. So essentially, loss and damage is really the impacts of climate change that exceed the adaptive capacity of countries. So we have a whole range of strategies around adaptation across the Pacific. The best of those strategies, I think, build from Pacific knowledge systems. But essentially, there is a scale now of climate impact that is being felt currently in the Pacific that is beyond adaptation. So in the last 5 years, there have been 2 Category 5 cyclones. That means that countries across the Pacific have barely managed to rebuild from one cyclone, and they have been impacted by a second cyclone. We're not just talking about the material impacts associated with loss and damage, we're also talking about what are called non-economic loss and damage. So I work on issues of displacement and resettlement. For example, we're talking about, and we can understand these, for example, from the perspective of Indigenous Australia, we're talking about loss of attachment to ancestral place, loss of attachment to belonging, loss of place, loss of burial grounds, loss of spiritual and ancestral homes that are attached with that kind of scale of displacement and resettlement. We're also talking about slow onset processes like sea level rise. These are all far beyond the scope of adaptation financing at the moment. So this is what we're talking about when we start to talk about loss and damage impacts. This is why loss and damage is at the heart of climate justice and the climate justice movement. It's about saying the Pacific, through no fault of its own, is bearing the impacts of climate change that are impacting people's ways of life today, right now. At what point in time do carbon emitting countries start to somehow finance the impacts of loss and damage? Now, this has been an intractable issue. This is something that Vanuatu first put on the table in 1991, and I'll show you the history of these claims. And it's never been moved until this COP. So in this COP, we had 2 sets of issues that we were working on in the negotiating room. In the first week, we did the work of operationalizing what is called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. So Santiago Network, because we built it in Madrid, and it's basically a technical network to try and make an assessment of loss and damage and to start providing technical assistance in climate vulnerable countries. So we built the functions of the Santiago Network at this COP. That's what we did in the first week. In the second week, the Pacific led with the proposal around a loss and damage finance facility. So this is the history of loss and damage finance being discussed through the UNFCCC process. So it began in 1991 with Vanuatu, making an argument for loss and damage financing through an insurance pool in a UNFCCC article, and it's been going ever since. So for 20 years, essentially AOSIS has been arguing for the need for loss and damage financing, but arguments have been made through the less developed countries as well. And it's now come to the point of being absolutely understood as a critical need. So the agreed AOSIS position going into this year was the idea that financing for loss and damage needed to be ramped up and accounted for in UNFCCC and Paris Agreement processes. That the resources for loss and damage needed to be in addition to the adaptation funding, the $100 billion pledge. And remember that that pledge is currently not being met. That our goal was a new stream for loss and damage finance, and that the finance needed to include a wide range of areas. So non-economic loss needed to be covered as well. Displacement, technology, all of the areas that I was just talking to you about. And on this basis, Fiji and Tuvalu proposed draft text. So Fiji worked on the drafting of the text, and Tuvalu, as our climate champion on loss and damage, then proposed the text in a high-level ministerial dialogue. And this is what the text looked like. There was two parts to it. Sorry, this is very technical. You know, this is my technical drafting. But I want to share it with you for transparency. And what it basically has is these two parts: a dedicated finance facility for loss and damage as the first part. And then the second part is a very small and discreet ask that we would establish a committee together with our partners from developed countries to undertake the work, adopt a terms of reference, call for submissions, meet, engage in a dialogue, and essentially come up with a series of recommendations on how to go forward in terms of operationalising this loss and damage facility and report back at the next COP. So we put this text forward, and essentially the G77, the whole of the G77, the whole of the Global South decided to come behind this text. It became established AOSIS text, and the Latin American countries, the African group countries, the less developed countries, all the blocks that make up the G77, India, China, came together behind this text. And in a high-level ministerial, again with the presidency, they launched G77 text, which essentially called for the same thing. So you can see it's drafted in the same form, 2 paragraphs, decides to launch a process for a facility or a financial arrangement, and that between this COP and the next COP, there will be meetings, workshops, essentially, to create a process to go forward. So in a very high-level ministerial meeting, all of the ministers, essentially, of the G77 bloc spoke. So Minister of Tuvalu, the Minister from Fiji, the Minister from AOSIS, the Minister from the African group, the Minister from Latin America, the Minister on behalf of the LDC spoke in support of this proposal. And at that point in time, America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia all said no. Absolutely not. How can you put a proposal like this on the table? This is the second week of negotiations. So then we went into the negotiation room. And over the next couple of days, we worked in a very detailed way with partners, and we moved most of those partners forward in the negotiations. And at the end of that period, so before the Saturday plenary, when COP closed, Friday night we negotiated till 3 a.m. with everyone, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, the UG, everyone on board, with the exception of the US and Canada, around launching this process moving forward, a refined version of this process, a process that engaged in this very facilitative conversation around what this would look like in partnership to launch a process towards a loss and damage facility. Okay. At the same time, the Pacific leadership had gone forward and mobilised. So our Pacific leadership, so the Fiji Prime Minister, the Fiji Attorney General, the Tuvalu Climate Champion, the RMI Climate Envoy, all went forward and met with leadership. So the Fiji Prime Minister met with Boris Johnson. He met with the UN Secretary General. He met with the entire UK presidency. Like people went forward in different directions. We met with the US, we met with the European Union at various levels in bilaterals and across the delegation, and civil society mobilised. And they mobilised around this hashtag Glasgow Facility for Loss and Damage. Philanthropists got on board and they started to commit funds to this facility. They said, if this is established, we will grant multiple millions of dollars to the establishment of this facility. However, we could not move the US and Canada. We could not move them. And because COP and CMA text, the COP text and the outcomes are driven by consensus, because we could not move them, we could not create an outcome for the text. So in the end, I'll show you the outcome text. We ended up with an operationalisation of the Santiago network. There was significant additional funding that was put on the table for the Santiago network in the last 2 days of the negotiations by the EU and by the US, but a very disappointing outcome on loss and damage finance. So this is the text related to loss and damage finance. It says, decides to establish a dialogue between the parties to discuss the arrangements for the funding of activities through this process by the 60th section. Now, the problem with this drafting, and I know that this is quite technical, but the problem with it is that it establishes a dialogue. It has a very long time frame. It's a 4-year time frame, but there's no outcome attached to it. There's no recommendations, there's no reporting, there's nothing at the end. It's simply a dialogue, meet and dialogue. So it's very, very far removed from what we were asking for and what we got incredibly close to an outcome on.
2 minutes to go, Siobhan.
Yeah, so my last slide is where to from here. So you've got to remember that this has been 20 years that this request has come. My sense is a loss and damage finance facility is inevitable. I think what we need to do now is prepare properly for that facility. We need to think as the Pacific about what we want in terms of a regional facility. What would it look like? What would it deliver? The needs of the Pacific differ substantially from some of the other regions. So the kinds of loss and damage impacts that are being experienced in Africa and in the Caribbean are substantially different from what's being experienced in the Pacific. And so the nature of a facility might look different depending on where you are. So I think there's a body of research that needs to happen I think we need to organise. I think we need to regroup. I think we have to be clear about what we want to articulate going forward. I think we need to mobilise, and I think we need to campaign clearly and prepare ahead of COP27. The fact that this COP outcome says that there's a dialogue doesn't mean that the next COP outcome needs to say that there's a dialogue. And it's very important to remember that. So COPs are processional. As soon as you finish one, you have to look ahead to the next one. And that's what I intend to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan, for the level of detail in a very short span of time, and for the great job that you did. Certainly that notion of mobilise, campaign and prepare obviously is a bit of a mantra that we need to pursue. And I guess, you know, just hearing the promises made and the letdown, that is often an experience, and this gives us something to mobilise, campaign and prepare for. So thank you very much. And in the midst of your quarantining finishing, we're really grateful you spent the time with us today. Now I've asked people who obviously you must have some questions for Siobhan out of that wonderful presentation. So I'm just reminding people to put those into the chat where Corinne will field them. Okay, again, Siobhan, thank you so much. Good
No
stuff.
problem.
Okay, our third speaker is coming to us tonight from Mandy. Langi Seru is a youth activist, and he has a work background in youth development, gender and human rights. He currently works as the Climate Justice Project Officer for the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, or as we know it, PICAN, which is the regional umbrella body for civil society organisations working on climate change in the Pacific. Langi is also the co-founder and coordinator of the Alliance for Future Generations Fiji, a young people-led network working on the issues of sustainable development. Now, Langi is going to speak to us tonight on Pacific civil society reflections on COP26 outcomes, including in the context of human rights. So, Langi, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Bulavinaka, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you, Phil, Corinne, and the Edmund Rice Centre Pacific Calling Partnership team for hosting this COP26 reflections session. Foremost, I'd like to acknowledge the hard work of Pacific delegations, both official and observer delegates who made their voice known at COP26. And we have some of these delegates with us, Dr. Siobhan, Maina, and Iemaima from PCC. And I see that there are also some fellow allies and accomplices, including Simon Bradshaw, who's worked closely with us here in the Pacific. I wish to begin by sharing that early in September, Climate Action Network International made a very bold decision to call for the postponement of COP26 for the very reasons of what we experienced at this year's COP. It was the most exclusionary COP that saw civil society being locked out from observing the negotiations, a ticketed system that restricted participation, and there were instances where civil society were being asked to vacate the negotiation rooms. And this was happening against the backdrop of COVID-19, where we also saw some of the Pacific countries whose country delegations were unable to travel due to COVID-19 restrictions, and others due to other logistical challenges, including visa requirements, high flight costs, or unavailability of flights. COP26 was supposed to be a crisis COP. We gathered in the middle of a global pandemic, expecting our leaders to take responsibility in tackling the climate crisis and demonstrating a renewed sense of solidarity. Rich and developed countries didn't deliver. On equity and inclusion, this COP and the UK presidency didn't deliver. Despite this, civil society organizations and social movements kept pushing hard from the outside, including from the streets of Glasgow during the Climate Strike March, which saw over 100,000 people who are out in the chilly Glasgow rain and winds to demand leaders to deliver more ambitious climate action. That was also one of the most energizing and inspiring experiences, because we often forget that it is where real power lies. Real power lies outside with the people. We saw the tremendous leadership from young people in and around COP26 with the real drive to secure our common future. Now, on the substantive outcomes from COP26, Pacific civil society were extremely disappointed with the outcomes, despite very few silver linings. In the lead up to COP26, the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network undertook a Pacific-wide consultation that led to the development of the Pacific climate demands, and which set out key asks of what should be delivered in Glasgow if it were to be a successful COP. So please allow me to share some of my reflections, in fact, our reflections against the top key demands that we took with us to Glasgow. The first key message we had was that fossil fuels are fossils, keep them in the ground to save the Pacific. And this means no new coal, oil, or gas projects, and an immediate end to all fossil fuel subsidies everywhere. And we saw how the language was watered down to coal phase down rather than the complete phase out of fossil fuels. Every single dollar and cents that goes towards financing the extraction of fossil fuel, every carbon molecule that is released into the atmosphere, and every single fraction in the increase of global temperature warming is detrimental to the Pacific people. It means loss and damage at a scale that threatens the security and the well-being of the Pacific people. In pledges, we saw more than 40 countries committing to shift away from coal, including major coal-using countries such as Poland, Vietnam, and Chile. In a separate commitment, 20 countries, including the US, pledged to end public financing for unabated fossil fuel projects by the end of 2022. These were some of the progresses, but we need to track, monitor, and hold governments accountable to these pledges that they have made. On NDCs, or National Determined Contributions, we demanded that the parties show real commitment, that the NDCs must limit global heating to 1.5 degrees, because we are already out of time here in the islands. Sustained, radical, and socially just cuts to emissions are required now, not later. The current pledges currently brings us to a 2.5 degrees Celsius pathway. Right now, the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is on life support, and that is not a good news for the Pacific, because for the region, 1.5 degrees Celsius is a fighting chance. Countries will see shifts in food and water security, disruptions to livelihoods, mass displacement, relocation of communities, and collapse of entire ecological systems. So we have 12 months to work hard to bring this target down. One thing is to produce these plans and make pledges. The other thing is to actually track the implementation of these plans. Otherwise, it's all just lip service. On climate finance, we demanded the developed nations show us the money to mobilize all of the promised 100 billion annually until 2025. The 2019 OECD report revealed that the wealthy developed nations still haven't delivered on this promise that was made back in 2009. While it was good to note that adaptation finance pledges that were made this year was over $350 million, and it's possible that contributions will continue to flow in before the end of the year. These, however, are far from what developing and climate frontline vulnerable countries actually need to adapt to the climate impacts. We need billions alone here in the Pacific and trillions more to ensure resilient Pacific peoples and communities. On loss and damage, COP26 was going to be the litmus test. Developed nations' political will is required now to finance and deliver support to the Pacific people who are already losing everything. For some countries, especially rich and developed nations, loss and damage may be the beginning of conversations and dialogues. But for us, it is a matter of survival. It is a matter of life and death. While the outcome from the summit recognized the gap in dealing with losses and damages in developing countries, the step to provide finance and deliver climate justice to the climate victims has been delayed. We are walking in inches when we must be moving in miles. We saw how the proposal from developing countries to set up the loss and damage finance mechanism was brushed aside, and Dr. Siobhan had alluded to that in her presentation. Brushed aside by rich nations, particularly the US, Australia, Japan, and the European Union. The silver lining that we saw on loss and damage is that we've begun to see the gate slowly opening on loss and damage. On the first day of COP26, Tuvalu and Antigua and Barbuda took an important step towards climate justice by announcing the establishment of a commission of small island states on climate change and international law, making it in very clear terms of taking their claims for loss and damage to international courts and tribunals. No longer will we wait patiently while pledges of the rich and the powerful go unfulfilled. No longer will we be lectured about needing to reduce our own meager carbon emissions while archaic development financing rules obstruct our access to vital funds. No longer will we pretend to be satisfied with the vague commitments and empty promises. We saw how the Scottish government made the first pledge of 1 million fund to developing countries to deal with loss and damage. Towards the second week of COP26, the increase is to £2 million, and the First Minister ramped up the language to say that it was not charity funds, but were reparations to frontline communities. It was also great to note that philanthropies were contributing an initial $3 million in startup assistance to support the objectives of the Glasgow Loss and Damage Facility. These are steps in the right direction, but we need to get the wealthy, responsible, and developed nations to follow suit. On human rights, we know that climate change is a symptom of deeper injustice and inequalities. Gender justice and women's human rights empowerment is a precondition for climate, social, economic, ecological, and climate justice. We went to COP26 saying that climate justice will prevail. The emissions of wealthy developed countries are already responsible for the loss of universal human rights and environmental rights of Pacific people, communities, and ecosystems. At COP26, it adopted decisions on the implementation of Article 6 relating to carbon markets that only included symbolic references to the preamble of the Paris Agreement. There weren't any concrete mechanisms to ensure that carbon offset projects and other non-market approaches for emission reductions do not violate the human rights of affected people. In particular, there is no reference to the obligation to respect human rights in the design of carbon market activities under the Sustainable Development Mechanism, nor to the obligation of states to respect the right of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. While the final adopted text indicates that grievances related to carbon offset projects can be addressed by an independent grievance process, there are no details about this mechanism. These weak references to human rights guarantees are particularly concerning as carbon offset projects pose enormous risk, particularly for indigenous peoples and groups most affected by the climate crisis. The adoption at COP26 of implementation rules for international carbon markets could lead to the multiplication of carbon offset projects around the world from states and companies. This in turn could result in indigenous peoples being dispossessed of their ancestral land and other communities being forcibly evicted in the name of climate mitigation projects. many of which, such as bioenergy and hydroelectric dams, have also dubious or limited impact in reducing emissions.
2 minutes, Longi.
The COP26 outcomes also adopted a 10-year work program on action for climate empowerment to enhance climate change education, training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information. However, it fails to root this work program in human rights law, principles, and standards. Explicit references to human rights as a guiding principle were removed in the final stage of negotiations at the end of the first week of COP26. However, the COP26 overarching decision urges states to respect, promote, and consider their respective obligation on human rights, as well as gender equality and empowerment of women in the implementation of the work program on action for climate empowerment. The outcomes from COP26 also totally ignored human rights, despite the UN Human Rights Council resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This was a stark failure to address the suffering of climate crisis victims. So what is the Pacific civil society response to this? Is that we will see you in the courts of law and in all other forums to protect and retain our rights. Vanuatu is already leading with support from civil society groups like the Pacific Islands, Students Fighting for Climate Change, and Vanuatu Climate Action Network, who are lobbying members of the UN General Assembly in their efforts to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the obligation of states in the context of human rights and climate change. So over the next 12 months, we need to keep the drumbeat of pressure on developed countries, including our neighbors, Australia and New Zealand. We need to ensure that all pledges and commitments made by governments outside of the multilateral processes at COP26 are captured in their NDCs. Importantly, we should work to ensure that the issue of phasing out all fossil fuels through a just transition is not left out of the agenda. We need to bring the energy and the real power that is within the growing global movements and social movements and from frontline communities and translate it into political power and political will. We have our work cut out for us, and so let's get the ball rolling. Let's mobilize, let's get focused, and let's continue to bridge community to national to global work. Most importantly, let's not forget the people who we serve and who have entrusted their hopes and their dreams for a fair, equitable, and sustainable world on our shoulders.
Round of applause. Thank you so much, Longi, for your passion. But I think it's something that's going to be much needed in your leadership in this space. Certainly, it's clear that the rich and the developed countries have not delivered, and if you put those in a list, Australia is probably captain, coach, and sole selector when it comes to not doing the right thing on this space. And I speak on behalf of all the Australians involved tonight that we have to do more. We have to do more. So thank you, Longi. Thank you so much. Our final speaker tonight is Iemaima Vaai, who's with us from Singatoka. Just got out of quarantine in Nandi and is cleared out south on our way to Suva. Iemaima is of Samoan descent, and she's a passionate advocate for ecological stewardship and for climate justice. She's currently working as the ecumenical enabler for the Ecological Stewardship and Climate Justice Desk at the Pacific Conference of Churches. And she has a background in environmental management, ecological justice, climate-induced displacement and migration, and Indigenous and Christian spirituality in the form of custodianship. Now, I think when Siobhan was talking, she mentioned that the impact of climate change on the Pacific goes beyond capacity to adapt, and it includes obviously the impact on things other than matters financial and economic. And to that end, Iemaima is going to share with us tonight, particularly in the role of spirituality and religion at COP26, and maybe touch a little bit on the involvement of young people, as she herself is as you can all clearly see. So, Iemaima, thank you for joining us from the wonderful village of Singatoka. You're very welcome. Over to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm just checking to see if my mic is coming through well.
Might get you to speak up as loudly as you can.
Okay. So firstly, I just want to commend my fellow speakers, Langi, Siobhan, and Maina for what they have shared, but also with what the work that they had done on the ground in COP. I would also like to extend my appreciation and my thanks to the Edmund Rice Centre for providing this opportunity and inviting me to come and speak along with my fellow Pacific delegates. So something that was really great to see in this year's COP was more recognition of the faith-based groups and the work they do in terms of ecological stewardship and climate justice, and how this also weaves into the spiritual aspect of things. So for years, Pacific churches have been nurturing and promoting this spiritual dimension where it advocates on how the being of the Pacific people are considered holistically and are integral and vital to development strategies. Since 1970s, religious faiths, and in particular Pacific churches, have been instrumental in not only producing indigenous and contextual theologies for the region that address the importance of the contribution of spirituality and indigenous community-based knowledge to a vision of holistic well-being, but also in challenging global colonial regimes and neoliberal developmental paradigms that destroy the natural environment. The outcomes of COP26, as echoed by my fellow speakers, showed a betrayal by those of our world leaders towards our Pacific frontline communities. It dictates how very profit-driven these world leaders are in choosing to phase down rather than phasing out of fossil fuels. What these world leaders fail to recognize is how the climate crisis is closely interlinked with the disruption of spiritual harmony to our Pacific identity and way of living. As I've shared in more of my recent interventions in COP, the dominant climate narrative that is today is driven by a secularized, human-centric agenda that often ignores spirituality. So while the physical impacts of climate change on the Pacific are well documented by science, the spiritual impact is less obvious. Usually this dominant climate narrative is framed to focus on science alone, therefore emphasizing only the tangible assets that the human eye is able to visualize. As a result, it therefore fosters climate solutions from this secular approach, which in return may not even touch deeply on the unseen wounds of our Pacific frontline communities. The issue with this is that each of these groups, such as humanity and environment, are often put in compartments and are supposed to be understood in isolation. But our Pacific identity and well-being does not categorize or compartmentalize the two. And this is usually seen as one or as a whole. Over the last few years, especially during COVID, I have seen people going back to their indigenous way of thinking and how this promotes a very sustainable way of living. It's been recognized that we all have our own climate solutions in the Pacific. And it's just a manner of decolonization and rethinking our development frameworks to one that accepts our indigenous way of living and thinking in a sense. I think moving forward, we need to recognize, especially within the international space, that we cannot compartmentalize any components such as humanity and our environment. So this dominant climate narrative that is today needs to be shifted to a new sort of narrative where it grounds our well-being, and our Pacific people are already taking up this recognition of how they have their own climate solutions through their spirituality and their indigenous way of living. During the 2 weeks of COP, our Pacific delegation were able to share on spirituality beautifully, especially around loss and damage with what Siobhan had shared earlier on, and how this weaves in the economic and the non-economic as well. This is something our Pacific is already pushing for in its demands, but on a global level, there still needs to be a strong push in the inclusion of this to ensure that there are no missing gaps in the process. Then moving on to something else that was really great, a highlight to see was in this year's COP was the amount of youths that made up the small delegation for the Pacific this year. Throughout the 2 weeks of COP26, you would usually people would usually see the Pacific youths running from event to event or accepting any last-minute invitation to speak, just to make sure a Pacific voice was echoed in any of those spaces. They were accredited for both observer and party officials. So whilst those who were accredited as party officials were working in the negotiation space, there were also those who were accredited as observers who held their own events in and out of the Blue Zone. On top of that, they took part in international press releases, TV and radio interviews, action stunts, panels, and so much more, just to make sure that the Pacific demands were being shared in each space to bring forward a strong voice that can help contribute and probably help ease the load for those who are working in the negotiation space. So despite the different roles and accreditation, both had much importance on the ground in COP, and it was able to bring out a powerful message on behalf of our Pacific communities. These youths, as I had witnessed, all of the youths that were able to attend as part of the Pacific delegation, they carried themselves with so much pride for their countries. They brought into their events a very Pacific way of doing things, and it really helped create real connections with those that they engaged with. The youths that were there, they were really there for the real business. And even though throughout the 2 weeks, it was for them a lot of long days and short nights, they were willing to be part of any space. And they showed a lot of power and leadership in the way that they presented themselves at COP26. Some of the challenges that were faced by these youths was that majority of the youths who were accredited for COP this year were all new to the space. So with the short amount of time that was given to do so, they had to really pick up on the ropes really fast in regards to what happens around COP26. And on top of that, there were issues with logistics such as accommodations, COVID testings, allowances, and so forth. Some youths even had nowhere to stay for 2 nights and had to look around to find some place to stay. And with that, that was some of the challenges that these youths were facing. But just to make these youths were facing, just to make sure that at least they are part of COP this year in person. I think overall, it was an overwhelming experience that had impact physically and mentally. And because there's so much happening around at COP, you can sometimes get lost with the whole circus parade that does happen around at COP. And people don't tell you how much of a roller coaster it is. And you get tired of having to, in each space that you're given the opportunity to share in, people don't, you get tired of having to repeat yourself just to ensure that your voice is being heard in those spaces. I think COP comes, just as a wrap up, COP comes with a lot of emotions, and it can really be draining at the end of the day. Yet with these youths, they continue to show up each day just to make sure that they were bringing a strong voice for the Pacific, and they were making use of their time traveling out to there. So that was some of what the challenges that they had gone through. And I think moving forward, especially to do with the youths, it would be good to see a lot of, in preparation to COP27, more support to these youths, especially to do with accreditation. I know a lot of there were some youths that had faced issues of reaching out to some of our regional community just in terms of getting accredited, but they were denied to do so. Yet, so they had to find different avenues to get themselves accredited and find some funding to do that as well. But they also pulled through with that as well. And I think just sharing from a youth perspective, moving forward and preparing to COP27 is that something that really needs to happen is the state as well as the civil society organizations, there needs to be real relationship that is created between the two, especially to do with like working with each other and so forth. I'm saying this because civil society organizations hold a lot of networks whether this would be regionally or internationally. And with that, the state can also step in and work with the civil society organizations and their networks to push these networks, to get these networks to push their world leaders to take up the demands that our Pacific people are pushing for. And that way it sets up a foundation that by the time we get to COP27, at least there's already a foundation that's set. And these world leaders are knowing what, already familiar or know of themselves what our demands are in order for the ability of us, of our demands to be taken forth and accepted in COP27 next year. So those were some of the stuff that I had wanted to share. But thank you again for inviting me into this space, Vinaka.
Thank you, Vinaka. Iemaima, thank you very much. And for highlighting not just the role of those young people, who I think will be a bit of a force come COP27, given they've had this experience. But secondly, for again, highlighting that there's so much more that we need to consider than just the economic or the measurable and the tangible, and that the work of decolonisation needs to continue, which for those of us sitting listening to you in countries like Australia and New Zealand, I think that's a message we've all got to pick up. So thank you very much, Iemaima, and a wonderful presentation. And if the role for young people in the future, if you're anything to judge by, that we're going to be in safe hands. So thank you very much indeed again. Okay, so now's our chance for a bit of Q&A, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Corinne, who's there somewhere, and Corinne's going to facilitate this segment of the webinar. We've got about 25 minutes or so to have a discussion. So Corinne, are you there?
I am.
Very good. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Can you all hear me okay?
I think
Yes.
lots of nodding going
Yep.
around the world
Good.
here, so I'm assuming that's all good.
Okay, so if you have okay, good. Right now, it wasn't before, but it may be now. So if there's any problem, I'll just switch my camera off. So first of all, I just want to thank all of the speakers. And I have to say that the COP didn't leave me with a lot of hope, and as many of us, but having heard the presentations, particularly Langi, Maina, and Iemaima, I just think that, you know, you guys are just going from strength to strength in the Pacific, and it's just wonderful. And I feel a lot better actually having heard you speak. So thank you very much. The Pacific Calling Partnership, as its name indicates, is very much about responding to the calls of the Pacific. And that's a point that you made very strongly, Iemaima. So I'll start with a question. And please, if you have questions, please paste them into the chat or lift your hand if you wanna ask it directly. So the question that I wanted to start with is, I know I've heard Siobhan speak before about loss and damage, and I know that you indicated, Siobhan, that Australia had actually played a somewhat constructive role in the loss and damage negotiations. So I wanted to get from each of the speakers a little bit of your impressions on Australia's role, because from what I hear, it wasn't all bad. So I'd be really interested in your experiences of Australia during this COP.
Would you like me to start?
That would be great, Siobhan.
Yeah, sure. Yes, look, Australia has a very complex positioning, obviously, on climate change, and often, and we can point to the many inadequacies of the Australian position at the moment. I need to speak about how Australia positioned itself in the loss and damage space. And what I can say is that Australia responded to the Pacific leaders. So the Pacific leaders went forward at a very high level and spoke to the Australian leadership, and the Pacific has a very unique status in relation to Australia. And so you will see, for example, in the closing plenary, if you look at the statements that are made by the Australian ambassador, what he says publicly is, we have heard the Pacific leadership in their calls on loss and damage. And what happened in the negotiating room is they shifted. And they shifted and they started being supportive. So Australia shifted, New Zealand shifted, the European Union shifted, the UG shifted. The only outliers who didn't shift in supporting the process to engage around a conversation, a committee structured process over a year. It would probably have been a subsidiary body process. There was an agreement that we came to at 3 a.m. on the Friday morning. And Australia really led that negotiation with the G77. They were really a bridging partner in that negotiation. And they did that because they responded to the Pacific leadership and their requests. So on this issue, they moved. And on this issue, they showed some responsiveness. Does that mean that I think that Australia has a perfect record on climate change? No, it doesn't. Does that mean that I think that they don't have substantial room for improvement? No, it doesn't. But it's important that we message appropriately thematically. And if you look at how I presented to you, I presented very clearly to say the outliers were the US and Canada. Because when we strategically move forward on our campaigning between now and the next year, we have to know exactly who was working with us and who was working against us. And that's really critically important. And the US refused to move, and that's a big problem. So there's a lot of effort that needs to go in that direction.
Thank you very much. Would the other speakers like to comment?
Yeah, I'll probably come in. Thank you so much. I do agree with Dr. McDonnell with what she said. From the perspective of Pacific people, yes, Australia can be, a good ally and come in on some of, the specific proposals in text that aligns with what the Pacific small island developing states are pushing for. But we need to also look at these holistically. And we know that the Australian federal government has been a supporter, has been pushing so hard on, the continuation of the fossil fuel industry. And we know that this is very harmful to the security, the livelihoods, and the well-being of the Pacific people. So in recent months, I think it was sometime earlier this year, we heard about, Australia's investment into nuclear submarines. When the Pacific leaders have, echoed in 2018 that climate change is the single greatest threat to the Pacific Island communities, and Australia is, from a security lens, from a security perspective, is seeing the growing influence of China in the Pacific. It doesn't see eye to eye to what the Pacific Islanders are seeing as the greatest security threat. To us, phasing out coal, oil, and gas is what we are asking for, because it's translating to loss of lives, it's translating to relocation of communities, to loss of livelihoods for ordinary people, especially more disproportionately, our frontline communities and the most vulnerable in communities. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of work to push, Australia, and we saw the climate pledge that was made by Australia just before COP, and even after they came back from COP, I think that I saw the statement where they said we're not going to revisit the 2030 pledge. So there's a lot of work, and part of the we've already launched before COP26. It is predicated on unspecified technology that somehow is going to capture carbon from the atmosphere. We want real solutions in the Pacific, not false solutions. So I guess that's my my input into that question. Thank you.
Thanks, Langi. Maina, I know that you have to go shortly, so I might just give you an opportunity to respond to this one.
I also want to acknowledge what my fellow speakers have alluded. It is very important, the role of Australia in the Pacific, as Langi said, especially looking to Australia as a big brother. I think we cannot deny that fact. It is a fact that we are living within the Pacific region. And most of the time when we speak about the Pacific, we tend to exclude Australia from that notion. But I think that is a wrong notion, and we should do away with that. We should always continue to speak that Australia is part of the Pacific countries. And therefore, I think there is a need to push more from the Pacific Forum side of things, like continue to advocate within the Pacific Forum. Then when we come to this kind of spaces, we don't go our own ways. We tend to be more solid in our stand in trying to address the interests of our people in the Pacific, not just the interests of the people in Tuvalu or other low-lying atolls, but as a region, looking from a regional lens or regionalism, which is very important for all of us to ensure the survival of all the Pacific countries and those who are affected by climate change. The support from Australia, the additional 500 million to make it a 1 billion pledge to support the Pacific countries is not directly goes to the Pacific countries alone. That includes the Southeast Asia as well. And Australia not contributing to the Green Climate Fund, I personally think it's kind of dangerous in a sense, because Australia can play around with these funds in the Pacific. It could be a slap in the face for Tuvalu, in a sense, like whatever we try to do to in terms of climate change related projects, it can be diverged. But what is more important, if we put those funds into the Green Climate Fund, we cannot do away with that. It's supposed to be, it comes under the understanding that all projects that comes out of the Green Climate Fund should be climate adaptation project or related projects. So those are the only few things that I wish to flag out. And all in all, I think the most strategic thing to do now is to ensure and solidify our stand within our Pacific nation, especially when it comes to the Pacific Forum. We should really solidify that relationship within the Pacific Forum before we go out to these kind of spaces. It is important that we do not exclude Australia in this kind of forum as a big brother. It is important that Australia continue to look after the young ones in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thanks, Maina. Iemaima, did you want to add anything?
Just a short intervention, echoing on what my panelists have also shared. Just bringing back the context of the neighbor that Maina had also shared earlier in his intervention, and how he was also sharing on how we shouldn't separate Australia from the Pacific, and we should see it as part of us. I think for us at the Pacific Conference of Churches, what we have been doing is we have been trying to work with the churches in Australia as well. We also do include them as part of our regional body in the Pacific Conference of Churches. And so bringing back to what I had shared on making use of the networks of our civil society organizations to get these networks to push their to push their leaders. And so with that, we've been trying to get the churches in Australia to try and push the government in Australia to take up the interests of our Pacific people in terms of climate justice and the demands that we're looking for. So I think that is just something I had wanted to share on that, but majority of everything else was shared by my colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks, Iemaima. That's and thanks to all of you. This is such useful information for us as an NGO in Australia to hear. Really, really precious, precious information. So thank you. I know that Maina has to go. So Maina, in case you have to leave us in the next few minutes, I just want to thank you again for taking time out. Maina hasn't seen his wife for about 2 years, I think, and she's just arrived today from New York. So I just want to really thank you for taking time out to be with us. And yeah.
That's what we call a sacrifice, Maina, and I think it's one we can't support.
Yeah, and I'm sure there'll be more discussions in the future.
Thanks.
Yeah. We're nearing, we've got a few minutes left. Does anyone else have a burning question they'd like to ask before we close? Samita?
Yes, thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to thank the organizers and speakers for today's informative session. So my question is, has the effects of climate change, which we know leads to rising sea levels, poor harvest, unpredictable storms, pushed Pacific Islanders into exploitative labor conditions and hence made them more vulnerable to human traffickers?
Does anyone want to say anything, Langi?
Sure, I'll attempt to answer that. Thank you for that question, Samita. And yes, we've certainly have reported cases in the media where not only children, but other vulnerable groups within our communities have been pushed into exploitative labor conditions. One of the things about the Pacific now is we're seeing growing number of climate-induced disasters, including tropical cyclones. And these are becoming more frequent and also increasing in intensity. And there have been reports where after cyclones, communities and families have lost their livelihoods, that some of the younger female in the families, even children, are engaged in, child labor. They've dropped out of school. There's been setbacks to development and to education. So school students have dropped out of school and are unable to go back to school because the family is prioritizing their recovery from the disaster, and they can't cater for school costs and the school needs. So as a result, children are engaged in child labor, but also young women and girls, who are being pushed into exploitative labor conditions, including, other sets of informal work, including sex work. We've seen growing numbers of, women and girls and persons of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities who need money to put food on the table after disaster has struck. And the only way to get that is to, engage in sex work, to earn that money and bring it home and ensure that there's food for the family. So yes, it's definitely happening. And there are cases where it's happening in Fiji and the Pacific. And perhaps I'm not sure if Iemaima wants to add on to that, but yeah, that's what I know about that subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Langi. And we've got a question from Addy. Addy, would you like to ask your question, or shall I read it out? I might just read it out. A question for Siobhan. Now that we have wrapped up with COP26, in what way can the Pacific improve its stand come COP27 in Egypt in terms of loss and damage discussions and negotiations?
So there's two questions. There's one below as well. That's also why the US and Canada are so resistant. So I'm going to pull them together. So the first thing that I want to say is that I'm going to go back to where I finished, which is kind of a very negotiator point to make. But the COP text outcome is only the text that we sit with for the period of time that it's the negotiating outcome, right? So the dialogue is a very unsatisfactory outcome. So we need to work out how to elevate it beyond that, and to negotiate a different form into the next COP. So to try and put a proposal forward that is more likely to gain acceptance and that can circumvent this existing process that has no outcome attached to it. The issue we've got in the Pacific, but actually is an issue globally, is that we're not well enough organized around what it is that we want, right? So there's some homework that we have to do. I've spoken to you about how I think probably, there's some different work that's been done on this. There's actually not a huge amount of work that's been done on this, not as much as you might imagine, partly because we haven't been as ready as we probably should have been for this conversation and for this moment. So we now have to get prepared, and we have to work out in the Pacific, what do we want in terms of this kind of facility? What would work? And there's a whole bunch of work that civil society needs to do in terms of informing that on behalf of, various constituencies. That shouldn't just be a conversation for states and for government, right? Because they're going to have a particular set of ideas around that. I think we need to do, we need to get creative about what that space should look like. We know that we don't want a GCF, like a Green Climate Fund GCF window. We don't want something like that. We know that we don't want an insurance facility or a risk transfer facility. So what is it that we do want? I am not a climate finance specialist, right? It's beyond my scope. But I do understand the practicalities of people and land in Melanesia, right? And I understand some of those impacts pretty well. So I know that we need to be able to find better pathways for people, and I understand some of the issues around relocation and displacement and resettlement. Not all of them, just some of the bits and pieces. But how do we start gathering that together? And how do we start beginning a conversation around non-economic loss and damage? Yeah. So there's some of the bigger scope of questions. the big issue around why the US is so resistant, the real answer to that is that the United States historically is responsible for 35% of global carbon emissions. They are incredibly concerned that this will become a conversation around liability and compensation. That is why they refuse to have a conversation around a loss and damage facility. So until we can open the door on that conversation, that's a massive blockage at the moment. So 35% for the US, the next major emitter is Germany, and their percentage historically has been around 4%. So there's a huge gulf there. And this is the space of climate justice. And I want to go back to my Australian answer again and say, you know, I also had the privilege of negotiating the Kainaki Lua text through the Pacific Island Forum, which came after the Boy Declaration text that Langi's talking about, which speaks about, you know, climate change being the greatest security threat to the Pacific, which the Pacific leadership has said repeatedly. And I'm just bringing up Kainaki Lua as, you know, it was the high watermark as a text, a regional text of agreement that Australia signed up to. You will remember at Tuvalu that it took 14 hours of the leaders sitting down to try and get an agreement over that text, but we negotiators had been negotiating it for 6 weeks preceding that leadership moment. And Lang is quite correct to point out that loss and damage was one small component of the asks in that text. So the first ask was nationally determined contributions. So the first ask of Australia is always come to the table and stop emitting carbon, right? And then fossil fuels. And then, so there's a whole set of asks, right? Processionally. And then there is loss and damage financing. And then there is adaptation financing. And so it is a package always when you look at Australia and you look at what they're doing. And as Australians, we must not just look at what Australia is doing globally and regionally, we have to look at what Australia is doing domestically. And right now, Australia is one of the worst governments in terms of land clearing of anywhere in the world. So there are a whole set of domestic issues, there are a whole set of regional issues, and then there are a whole set of global issues.
Yep.
Thanks, Siobhan. It certainly sounds like we've got our work cut out for us. Is there time for one last question, Phil? I've got Nanisa.
You could squeeze in one more.
Okay, Nanisa, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much for the free speakers of sharing your experience in Glasgow. Hearing you sharing your experience, I want to ask you, because it looks like money development needs. My question is, how will you balance all this? Because you are representative the people from the Pacific, and all the Pacific has different issues. At the same time, it's a focus on fossil fuel and also climate change. I know there is a need for dialogue, networking, but from your experience in the COP26, do you see which area that needs for the Pacific, because Australia and New Zealand are included there? Because it looks like we are pointing to all the country development or the country that help us to develop, but there is also a need for us from the Pacific to see how we respond to that need, because that's why we That's why we say yes to the mining, or because people needs money. So I'm asking, how will you see from that area? Because you represent the Pacific, you are also going together with the Prime Minister here in Fiji and all the leaders. So,
yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. It's a complicated one, and I'm not sure that we have enough time to that's a whole separate webinar on its own, I think. But is there any quick comment from any of our speakers in response?
Yeah, just to respond to that. Yeah, it's a very complex question. There's no single bullet answer to that. But yeah, I think that's something the Pacific island governments are also struggling with to balance. While we are also we're on the front line of climate leadership, it's also our just transition to low carbon economies that we need to balance, because obviously our countries, our people are in need of development, and they need to advance their way of life, etc. So, and this is why the conversation around climate finance is really important, because those, the US $100 billion that was pledged by developed countries, that is what our countries need for just transition, for adaptation of local communities. But again, there's no single silver bullet answer to that, and it's a very complex question that our Pacific Island governments are also working through. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Langi. And thanks to everybody for your participation. We are unfortunately out of time, but I think this has really clarified the way forward, certainly for me, in terms of Pacific climate advocacy. And I hope that you all found it helpful. So over to Phil to close the event.
Thank you, Corinne. And it's yes, that last question, Nanice, is it's certainly one we could spend most of the night and adjourn to the bar and probably not resolve it. But it's but it points to the complexity of the complexity that's been played here. And there's two things that I picked up tonight, I think, that just re-emphasised for me. One is the power of the Pacific voice, and that the Pacific voice is on the global stage is absolutely fundamental. And the second is the power of partnership between the Pacific Islanders and those of the rest of us in civil society, or in the negotiations, or at the high-end politics, and in churches and civil groups. That partnership is something we've got to hang on to as we mobilise, campaign and prepare and go forward to Sharm el-Sheikh when the 2030 targets will be hopefully put on the table. But thank you to all of you who attend. I want to thank in particular our four speakers who gave us passion, detail, commitment, and clarity. And so to Maina, to Siobhan, to Langi, and to Iemaima in Sydney, in Canberra, in Singatoka, and in Nandi, thank you very much, as I will get everyone around the world to applaud. Your expertise and your heart for this process was wonderful. There's a guy up in Brisbane by the name of Sean Cleary who has been running the show tonight. So Sean, thank you to you for that. To Corinne and the staff of the Edmund Rice Centre, and particularly for the Pacific Calling Partnership and your leadership, Corinne, I want to thank you very much. I guess the takeaway finally is that all of us who are attending here, there's a job for all of us here. In Australia, it's to hold our government's feet to the fire. But it's also to remember that, the great saying from Martin Luther King, often quoted by Barack Obama, that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. But what they didn't say is it takes people to do the bending. And when it comes to climate change and climate justice, that's the task we all face, to use our vote, to use our voice, and to use our feet, and to work together with our Pacific friends in partnership to bring about the change we need to see for the survival of the planet, and particularly for the Pacific Islanders. So for those in the Pacific, I thank you for your leadership, thank you for your courage, thank you for your inspiration, all strength to your arm. To those who attended tonight, thank you so much. And wherever you are in the world, let's keep at it. Thank you,
everybody.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
ありがとう。
Hi, Cherubini.
Hi, Sister Janice. I can recognize your voice.
Thanks, Corinne.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Nice to
Corinne.
meet you. Thanks, Phil, Corinne, Jill, Maria,
Hey, Jesse.
Tosia. Tosi.
Good to see you.
Yeah,
Thank-
nice to seeing you too all here.
Thank you, Sean. I'm off, mate. Okay. You.
Thank you. I just unmuted myself. It's Pearl Waimara. Thanks very much.